want to think a little bit, maybe starting with you, Rick, to build off of your remarks, focusing in on Merck's One Health vision, which is very clear and direct, and it's something that I certainly applaud Merck in taking a leadership role within the industry. So from your vantage point, what are some of the practical applications of that vision to Merck's work, and what does that focus mean for the future of drug development?
No, that's it's a good point. And so, as I mentioned, we're one of the only two companies in the world that focus on both humans and animals. So for us, it's critical. We've been working on viruses and diseases that animals have gotten that hadn't gotten to people for decades, right? So if you look at COVID, Merck Animal Health has been making coronavirus vaccines for 25 years. So we were very familiar with that disease before it even got into humans. And so what we would like to do is focus on things before they get to humans, and obviously that's a big focus of ours. So we work on things like we're the top provider of rabies throughout the world vaccines to make sure, even in developing markets. We also send people into Africa. We donate product into Africa, and we send veterinarians into there to vaccinate animals. We do this. We have eradication programs throughout the year as well to make sure that that terrible disease isn't obviously inflicting humans as well. We'll do shared research in terms of looking for solutions. We're also looking for ways to responsibly use antimicrobials to make sure that when you get sick and go into the hospital that there is something for you that works, because that's one thing that we should worry about in the future, and Merck will do its best to make sure that stays the case. And then we work on a whole host of foodborne pathogens and diseases like salmonella. We have a very high food safety effort with most governments to make sure that the food supplies are strong. Obviously, in the U.S., we enjoy one of the safest food supplies, but we want to make sure everybody in the world does that as well. So.
That's wonderful. Well, and I think one of the things that, obviously on the animal health side, me being in the women's health space, I don't necessarily always think of this, but you did mention animal intelligence as you're sort of thinking about One Health. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I don't know that that's something that we necessarily think of when we think of sort of the healthcare space.
No, that's a good question. Thank you. So Merck Animal Health is the largest provider at scale of technology in the animal space. And so we have it both sides, and I'll talk about food production first, because from a One Health perspective, this is how we get to a more sustainable food supply. So we do things like identification of animals, screening of animals, so that not every animal that comes in for, let's say, confined feeding or pasture feeding gets an antibiotic right off the bat. We do surveillance work, so we actually look for sick animals and make sure that we're not misusing drugs, or our industry is not misusing drugs. And then obviously we have a lot of equipment that determines the health of animals. So in order to, especially to give veterinarians and farmers and people that grow up in the food production world more time, you can get access to real-time data on your phone now, so that you don't have to spend 20 hours a day right on your farm. You can actually have some free time with your family, but you can tell if something's going on. And so they get a reading every 15 to 18 seconds, depending on the type of animal. And this also helps in the efficiency of raising the animals. We're able to provide feeding protocols. And so you'll see more of this, and it's significantly improved dairy output throughout the world. The Netherlands, obviously, one of the bigger output producers of milk in the world, but there's a lot of markets that would like to actually match the production of the Netherlands or some other markets in dairy production, and so we try to help with that as well. And then on the pet side, we have the same thing. So a lot of people in their spare time noticed that their pets were doing things that they were always doing, but they were home during COVID to see it this time. And so that created a lot of angst in people. And so now we have health applications. So we have trackers, we have activity trackers that can tell scratching, barking, biting, We have food monitoring bowls, so if you have two pets and one of them needs medicated food, a microchip will tell you which one is sick, and the feeder won't open up to get the medicated food unless they're there. Same thing with drinking. If your cat has diabetes, which can be very common in cats, we have watering bowls so you can track how much water they're getting to make sure they're getting the right amount of things. So a lot like that. Stay tuned for a new product coming out this year, which will be a GPS tracker for your dogs. That way you know exactly where they are at all times when they get out of the house.
I may need that. As someone who recently took a family visit to the vet for a dog with potential anxiety, because we noticed some things over COVID, all of that is very important. So thank you for that. And you touched on this during your remarks, but I'd like to ask Dr. McCubbins, given Merck's global presence and your commitment to science and innovation, can you talk a little bit more about Merck's relationship with the Netherlands and why it's so important?
Sure. You heard some of it this morning. I mean, we stood up a company, Organon, which was a prior name within the Netherlands. We had a lot of help to do that. I mean, the Netherlands government actually helped us stand that up. That's the most recent example of it. But if you really think about it, Merck's been in the Netherlands since 1954. We opened our first European headquarters there, building on a strong legacy of three big companies, Merck and Intervet, Organon. So you've got those three companies in the legacy within the Netherlands. But the reason we're there is scientific excellence and innovation. If you think about Netherlands, that's the hallmark of the Dutch people for us. That's what we see, that's what we get when we show up there. And it's built around, I think you have 8 medical universities, you have 14 other universities, something like that. And they help us with clinical studies. We hire a huge number of people from those universities to come into things such as the animal health research, human health research. So if you look at what the Netherlands brings to our technical base, it is tremendous. But it's the innovation coupled with that technical excellence that really drives that partnership. And you can see that with a host of products that's developed, both either animal health or human health throughout the years. I mean, I would say that scientific excellence and innovation is what brought us there, and that's pretty much what keeps us there.
If I could add, I would just say, I'll give you just a quick story. The Netherlands tends to be at the forefront, right? And that's what makes it so critical. So I remember flying over exactly 11 years ago to Amsterdam to figure out what we were going to do. I met Mr. Jacobs for the first time and told him that if you help me, I will not only build the biggest production site you're going to have in this country, but we'll become a global leader in the animal health space. And today, we were less than $2 billion in sales back then. We're well on our way to 10, and he helped us not that long ago, and that's because they understood the benefit of an economic relationship. We helped set up a tax box. He introduced me to the Minister of Finance. We met with the Prime Minister. I mean, it was the now Queen was the princess at the time, came to open up one of our facilities, and so not only does it recognize the relationship, but just motivates our people so much.
And I think that really, illustrates, right, when we think about healthcare, at least in my world and sort of the U.S. health policy world, we really think of it at the micro level. We're not necessarily thinking about it from a global perspective. And I think particularly in the time of COVID-19, particularly in the time where we're looking at vaccine supply chain issues, and you touched on this as well, production of oral antivirals. I mean, I think to get us where we are today, literally in this room, really seems like a great success, but also a miracle in a way, because I think 2 years ago we were not in this place. And so I wonder if, Dr. McCubbins, you can elaborate a little bit on that and sort of what it meant, not necessarily for the Netherlands, but also international relations and the future of the industry too.
Well, I think if somebody was really deeply involved in the development of our own internal vaccines, which we ended up shelving in favor of helping another company, I would simply say the entire pharmaceutical industry deserves a lot of credit. If you think about how long it takes to develop a vaccine, from the time the pandemic was declared to the time a successful vaccine was out was less than 12 months. And that's remarkable. And there was a lot of consternation around whether or not the safety profiles and protocols were met. But I was involved in that, and the same safety protocols that were used to develop any vaccine, we went through that. It was an accelerated path that just literally unprecedented. And the entire pharmaceutical industry came together in a way that in my 33 years at Merck, I had never seen. I mean, cooperating. I mean, we worked with Moderna, we worked with J&J, we worked with a whole host of other ones that had ideas for vaccines that actually did not come to fruition, and every kind of possible platform you can imagine. But the industry itself coalesced around a mission that was remarkable, and I think that coalescence and that cooperation is what drove that success. And I'm proud of what we did within Merck. I mean, we developed 2 vaccines. They were good vaccines, but we also recognized that the other vaccines on the market, we were better served by actually putting our efforts behind someone else's vaccine. And how many times would you have seen that happen ex-COVID, where you actually say, you know what, I'm going to shelve my vaccines and I'm going to go partner with somebody else because I can bring my regulatory and manufacturing expertise, to bear to help them get their vaccine to the market faster, because we looked at our data, we looked at their data, and we felt like their vaccine was probably a little bit better, and we put ours on the shelf. Now, the other side of that is we have an oral antiviral. Molnupiravir is the generic name, but it's Lagivrio, which is the trade name, and that oral antiviral is a critical for fighting COVID, for critically ill patients. And so we're proud to have been involved. Rick mentioned how quickly we brought that. My area was one of the areas that had to bring that forward. I can attest in all the products I've developed over the years, we have never brought a product to bear that fast. And that was even a shorter cycle than 12 months. I mean, from the time we realized the data was good to the time we had to actually deliver that, it was more like 8 months. And if you think about that time frame to get compression and get that out on the market, it's a lot of risk involved with that. It's a lot of commitment from Merck to say, you know what, I don't know whether or not this is going to work, but I'm going to invest a couple of $2 billion in the supply chain around that. And that's something that you saw a lot in the pharmaceutical industry that, quite frankly, you didn't see before COVID. So from a manufacturing perspective, it's been remarkable. Touching more closely to Harlem, I mean, it was mentioned here that Harlem is an integral supply node to molnupiravir delivery. And Harlem is actually, I'm going to give you a snapshot of Harlem and how important it is to Merck. We have 2 major hubs that distribute Merck's products across the world. One is in North Carolina in Wilson. The other one is in Harlem in the Netherlands. And between those 2 sites, you can probably put 95% of all the products we distribute globally through those 2 sites. And the largest by far is Harlem. So Harlem is a critical part to us globally as a company. It was critical in terms of the molnupiravir distribution. But we did leave one site out, and I'm going to have to mention it, but Daher, which is our biologic site, is also near and dear, just in case people are counting names and trying to read anything into that. We do have another site that's very important to us, our biologics facility right outside of Oss. So big picture is I think the pharmaceutical industry came together in a way that was unprecedented, and it actually made a difference to the world. So we're very proud of that.
Yeah, as you should be, and I think we're all very grateful. And one of the things, again, noticing through the video and looking at the efforts of Merck throughout its history, was really thinking about your commitment to philanthropy. And I mentioned sort of where I have been familiar with that, but I also think there are many other ways in which it has been critical to things like precision medicine or the pipeline of biomedical innovators. And so I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit more about the philanthropic efforts.
Sure. And I think if you really look at Merck's mission, and you can see it in the video, and I worked on many of those projects, Crixivan, I remember when we put Crixivan out. If you think about our philanthropy efforts, it's really core to what we do. I mean, you heard George Merck say it. I mean, the medicines are for the people. And that's the way that is really the ethos inside the company. And I'm going to give you a brief history of it, right? So many of them aren't listed here. The NIH came to Merck in 1968 with an innovative biologic. It's Merck's first biologic, by the way. And no one would make it. It was a drug called Elspar for childhood leukemia. And literally, it was the standard of care all the way up to through 2010 for childhood leukemia under 6. But Merck signed up for that, even though it was not a moneymaker. It was actually a money loser. We made that product. Then you've got Mectizan, 1987, where we basically set out on a path to cure river blindness. And it's been cured in 3 or 4 countries. We're still on the mission. Well over 4 billion regimens have been given away. Harlem makes that from scratch. They make it they don't make the active. They formulate it, package it, and distribute it. But it's the other unsung things that you don't know. It was Mexizan, it was Crixivan that was brought to bear on the AIDS epidemic that we were having. And there was a patient assistance program that went with that to make sure that people who couldn't afford it could get it. And you can just go down the list of all the different ones. We were the first statin. We were the first bisphosphonate for osteoporosis. We were the first acid pump inhibitor. I mean, you can go down the list of innovations within Merck, and all of those are tagged with bringing those medicines to the people. So the latest, and you guys may or may not know this, the Ebola outbreak that was in 2012, I think it was 11 or 12, in Africa, killed the most people of any Ebola outbreak. Merck actually partnered with the company. We developed the first Ebola vaccine, which we have today. It's the only Ebola vaccine. And so when you think about that all the way up to today with Molnupiravir, you can start seeing the commitment Merck's got. And I would simply say it this way: if you stare into the face of unmet medical need, you're going to find Merck staring back. And we've been there a long time. And it is important for us to bring cutting-edge science to unmet medical need.
Yeah. I mean, things that you wouldn't see investment in otherwise, as you mentioned, is just critical. Rick, can you talk a little bit about the animal health side of the philanthropic efforts?
I'll also mention, since you brought it up, the situation with Merck for Mothers, because even though we talked about Merck had separated Organon and put it back into its own space. Most of the women's health business went with that Organon business, yet, Merck still has Gardasil, obviously a big product for women, but it still invests heavily in Merck for Mothers program and continues to provide foundation money to support, significant support for that Merck for Mothers program. And so that's the type of philanthropy work that Merck wants to be known for. As Tom said, working on Ebola, they were never going to make any money off that vaccine, right? There's a lot of things we do that we'll never make money on. We do that in animal health all the time. Anytime there's an outbreak of something, they come to us, right? So we're working on swine fever, avian influenza, high-path avian influenza, African swine fever, you name it. We're working on things in that. And so, that tends to be just something that the company feels it has to do to provide for the world. If you look at some of the efforts we do, diversity and inclusion is a big part of who Merck is. And so we provide scholarships to underprivileged, but also minorities, especially on the veterinary side. We want to put as many people through either ag science or veterinary programs that we can. We want to try to lower the debt that students have coming out of school, and so we do a lot of that work. Probably in the last, let's say, 4 years, we've provided over $6 million in scholarships alone to just veterinarians. And so, and then we provide any one of thousands of donations around the world of either product or resources or money or time. A lot of our people donate time to get involved in efforts. I talked a little bit about our rabies program, but we partner with a project called Mission Rabies, which takes veterinarians from our company. We donate the product and they go to African nations to vaccinate for rabies, to try to reduce the deaths around the world for rabies. And so you see more and more of that. And then obviously we get into any one of the product donations around the world where people need things, they can't get access, as Tom said, to medicine. And so Merck's there with access programs as well for both humans and animals as well.
Yeah, I love this idea of pulling it together. It's really critical. You don't necessarily think of how close of a connection it is, right?
Yeah,
So.
no, it really
An
is.
advantage, and I'll give you an advantage to having a close network with animal health. I mean, most people don't know this, but we were actually, the reason we were able to accelerate Ebola to the market, we actually converted an animal health facility
Yes,
to actually make that come true.
I'm
And-
painfully aware of that.
I know. And I was actually in animal health when we did it, but and he reminds me. The other thing people don't realize is it was a brand new animal health facility in Boxmeer that we had just built, a fill finish live facility that when I was in the midst of trying to decide how we were going to, within a network, supply COVID vaccine, I happened to remember that when I was in animal health, I started building one.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. We, we have expertise in vaccines. We made over 130 billion doses of vaccine in animal health last year. So we make more than anybody in the world. But we have expertise too, so we share those resources. We have joint vaccine meetings with animal health researchers, scientists, and human health. And so when Ebola hit, we knew we had a facility that would be put to better use by taking care of that. The freeze dry facility in the Netherlands, I really needed the supply out of it. The Prime Minister had promised he was going to be there for the opening, and then we decided to shift course and move that over to COVID production. So that's what Merck can do, and it has a lot of science everywhere in the organization.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like that flexibility, particularly during a global pandemic, has been really critical and has worked very well for you all.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, excellent. Well, is there anything else that you would like to leave with the audience before we wrap up? Anything you didn't?
There you go. I would just say I would like to thank everybody again. A lot of people in here did a lot of work for today. I do appreciate everybody's interest in Merck. I'm sure we touched somebody's life in some way since birth, and so I want to make sure you really knew who was behind that company, because there's people behind that name, and they're working really hard for the world. So thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. All right.